questions about all of them. Can you just do a quick walkthrough?
Sure. So the first point here about China has a large economy and it's growing is going to try to make the point that imposing an economic sanction on China is a little bit like, trying to defeat Godzilla with like a pair of scissors, right? It's far too big a behemoth to be materially affected by such a relatively small decrease in economic activity, which is kind of a lot of this, also the second point, just, the sanctions that we're likely to impose are not going to be enough to affect them. The third point is that we've been down that road before, right? Like we've lived through now a trade war with China, and was there significant change in what China did with the Uyghurs? No, not really. So we're making the point that we kind of know that they aren't going to work, at least as far as historical examples are concerned. The third one, again, makes the point that China is also a country that's like expanding its influence, its ability to trade with different countries. We have examples where they've started trading with Iran, where we tried to sanction Iran to kind of stop their economic activity, but China's trading with them, so that kind of undercuts the idea of sanctions. So basically they'll find a way to get their trading done, no matter what we do. And then the fourth is the moral point that we were making before, where they view it as just standard counterterrorism practice. And, we have done questionable, quote unquote, standard counterterrorism practice before. So in terms of morals, for us to say, oh, this is especially wrong is kind of hypocritical and will undercut any attempts to make them look especially bad. All right, talk a little bit about actual contentions that Khan might be able to write now. So the first one goes kind of the following way. Your uniqueness argument, your description of the status quo is that China is a country that has built itself up as kind of fighting back against the forces that have kept it down, the forces that have had sort of predatory relationships with them, sometimes oppressive relationships with it in the past. So that makes it sort of very prone to nationalism. That's going to be important because what you're going to say as Khan is that when we sanction them, they're going to get mad and they're going to kind of double down on the feeling of us versus everyone else. And what that does is kind of enable the autocratic leader and support the autocratic leader's discriminatory practices and policies. So it allows him to double down on what we would call the human rights violations that he's doing. The example of Trump detention camps, Muslim bans, just an example of like how nationalism is connected to those policies. And then you're going to make the point that like human rights violations are bad. So thinking about this one, because this one is going to be, this one is a great one in the sense that chances are Pro is going to have a contention about human rights. So if you can win this contention, it would win you a lot of ground. But you really have to be able to explain it well to win this contention. So what we wanted to do is brainstorm a little bit and think like, okay, how does nationalism happen? Is anyone willing to take a stab at that? Like, how does nationalism work?
By othering other people, by saying we're being hurt or attacked, and you're not so bad. I mean, by appealing to people's sort of fear and sense of potential loss or loss that's already happened.
Good. So can you, by you I mean anyone, including Emily, if you want to continue building on it, can we build on that to explain why the Uyghur cleansing / detainment might be connected to nationalism? Maybe let's go back one step. Do we remember who the Uyghurs are in
Well,
general?
they're Muslim, right? They're
Mhm.
Muslim and they're Turkish. So
Mhm.
is there an argument that they're infiltrating the pure culture of China and introducing ideas that are threatening to this pure idea that they've had? I mean, it also seems blatant from the outside. It seems blatantly like picking on a little guy, and picking on difference of skin color and like some serious racism built in. But the nationalist argument would be they are threatening us. I'm assuming.
Yes. So
Right, to make that foreign influence into something dangerous to to China's the fabric of China's society somehow.
Right. Is it like they are infiltrating us and seeding dissent? Is it that they are infiltrating us and introducing religious practices that we don't think are okay? Because right, yeah, are they painting Islam? Are they painting Islam as like a mindless worship, and you need to and are right? They're counter extremist. Okay, fine, right. It's an extremist group. They are prone to violence. Blah 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 blah.
Yeah, so what they call, and I didn't actually want to like interrupt your speech with that, where I just wanted to get it out there for later. Yeah, what they call is kind of like they think that they're doing counter extremists, or they say that they're doing counter extremist practices, and that's what they paint it as when the rest of the world asked about it. So definitely this idea of like, yeah, they are a threat to us. There was this one terrorist event in like 2000. They've been using the same secure, and so this is where also you might, as Khan bring up the hypocrisy point. They're using the same kind of like terrorism as existential threat framework that we did starting in the 2000s, right? So like, there was this one terrorist event. The Uyghur, it was identified that it was kind of Islam's extremism, and there we have it. They just kind of ran from there. So
is Chinese propaganda the same propaganda that we use? Is it the same sort of? Do they point to the Middle East? Or is it specific to Uyghurs?
Interesting. I don't actually know if I don't know how much like relationality there's been with the Middle East in general. Because in principle, it seems like they're on decently good terms with the Middle East insofar as they're like investing in it. So that's a good question. If you were going to go the hypocrisy, it'd be interesting to paint more of those parallels, definitely. So since you're going to be talking about human rights this whole time, you're going to have essentially like the same impact if you're arguing this contention against the pro. You're going to be saying that like human rights violations are bad. We totally agree. We're saying that we solve better for human rights violations by not sanctioning China. So what your debaters are going to have to think about and win, if they want to win this argument, is that like the we solve better statement. So this explanation of how nationalism leads to these policies is going to be super important, because it's kind of easy to say like punish the people who are doing human rights things. There's just sort of more mental work to do to show that it will cause more human rights violations. So there's more explanation required. So there's a term and this term is in the notes. The vote in terms of who wins the round, in this case, could come down to the strength of the link, which is just what we call like, who do we think it's more probable that actually causes their impact? Other questions about this contention? Go ahead.
Oh no, just real quickly, going back on the question of the Uyghurs, a little bit of real quick background. Most of the tensions start basically because the Han Chinese expanded. They wanted the land, and so they expanded into these regions where the Uyghurs were, apparently fairly peaceful before. And basically, for the land grab, it was required then, you know what I mean? It can't just be saying we're taking your land. There's a reason why we get to be here, and you know, why it's ours now, kind of a thing. And then that goes to, yeah, picking on religion and such, and other cultural differences, like you said before, to other them in their own home, so to speak. And then of course, since then then it goes into like, well, they're holding, you know, us back from these great leap forwards, quote unquote, great, you know, them not getting on board. 20, 30 years later, it becomes like they're not getting on board with us, and they continue to do these practices that are, you know, backwards and not along with what we want to do to accomplish this great country. So it's not quite as race-based as I thought it might be. It seems like that's more of a cover based on some quick research.
Gotcha.
What time period was the first part that you were talking about?
I think the 30s to the 40s. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and so basically there's a land grab, an expansion,
Okay.
and then there's after the expansion kind of started, there's an annexation of the land, because at this time I think China's still split, and I guess maybe it was maybe some of these Western territories weren't under control yet of the communists. I guess I haven't looked into
Right.
it quite.
Okay. No, thank you. I just didn't have the time frame, but thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah, that was really awesome. Thanks a lot. That was actually really.
For sure. So the other thing that you can kind of generally talk about is the fact that sanctions as economic decrease to the economy. China, famous level of inequality because they've really done wonders for their eastern part, really brought up the middle class. On the other hand, the western part is very much not as affluent as the eastern. They're kind of not nearly as advanced economically. So the point you'll be making is that a decrease in economic activity will not hurt the richer eastern part as much as it will the poorer part of China. That'll increase the wealth gap, therefore, disproportionate harm, therefore loss of, harming the rights of the poor in China. In terms of human rights, you could think about, I guess, is sustenance a human right? And that's a debate you might have. How important is that human right compared to others is also a debate you can have. But that's one way to go with. It's an easier way to explain why sanctions would be bad for people in China. The only thing with this is you definitely want to think about or just make sure to explain at some point how many people are affected, because it's not as totally obvious. It's not as easily obvious as it is necessarily in the first case, where you could either be going for morality on its own, or just the number of people being the number of Uyghurs. Another one, and
ask a question in this?
Sure.
Sorry about that.
Wait, did you ask your question or is it just me?
Yes, you might.
It might be that you're breaking up for me alone because my connection's bad, or it might be for everyone else. By everyone's faces, I'm thinking it's for everyone. Maybe if you want to ask it in the chat,
Yeah.
if there's no clear solution to the audio at the moment. Yeah, I hear you there.
Yeah, I'll type something in the chat after. Go. I don't want to hold everybody up. I have to think about how to phrase it if I'm going to write it.
Well, that was perfect.
Okay.
We could hear you clearly right there, though.
Yeah, that's funny. That part
Yeah,
came out.
It's in and out all day. I have 5 classes. I think 3 of my classes, my Zoom meeting quit out like twice or 3 times during 3 different classes today. It's been
Oh,
really
dear.
fun. Yeah. So, oh God, I forgot my question now. I just met with my team just a little while before this meeting, and we were talking about just when we were saying before, if the sanctions, if the sanctions cause more harm, and I know, PF is not about alternate solutions, but how, like, if you're arguing that, the sanctions cause more harm, so we shouldn't do sanctions, like, then there's no response at all. Like, how does the con, like, support, if they're then going to say, it's it outweighs the pro, like, there's no upside for the con. It's simply saying, the sanctions don't, the sanctions either don't work or the sanctions cause more harm, especially if you're talking about, if it hurts human rights, to bring up that argument. So if you do nothing, then, that's a guarantee that nothing changes. If you do nothing, if there's no sanctions, if there's no response. So how, I don't know. I'm just.
Well, I mean, I think that's, I just wanted to chime in and say one thing, and then, but just because, that's a good thing. One thing to think about, and it's something I think a good point to just talk to students about generally, is that as humans, we always want to feel like we can do something about everything, right? Like, where there's a problem, you think, like, no matter what it is, if it's the insurrection of the US government, there's got to be something I can do, right? But we can't always do anything, right? And sometimes what we can do, like, maybe the only thing is to make it worse, right? Like my link turn example of, like, say it's like you're up playing TikTok till 2 a.m. or how, I guess you don't play it, you view it, right? And at 2 a.m. you realize you forgot to study for your math test. And it's like, well, is it really going to help you to study for your math test till 4 a.m. and fall asleep doing the test? You're going to end up getting a worse grade. So sometimes, as unfortunate as it seems, right? Like, sometimes we can't really do anything about stuff, and sometimes maybe the only thing we can do make it worse. It's very unsatisfying. Right? It's very unsatisfying, but I think it's kind of a good, useful discussion to have, right? Because it is, I mean, I don't think anybody's going to advocate that we invade Taiwan. I mean, invade China because of the situation. I mean, it's pretty bad over there from what I read, right? And Amisha accuses me of being a China apologist, right? I do work in China, but it is bad, right? But, like, we're going to invade the place. If we can't do anything, we're just going to make it worse. It's frustrating. But that can work both ways. You can realize a judge is, come on, judge, you got to at least try, right? Which might make sense if it didn't cause any harm, but it is a frustrating part of life sometimes.
Yeah, we had this interesting discussion about sort of the carrot versus the stick approach. Sort of the punitive sanctions as punitive, against sort of incentives, and but then we were also kind of debating the idea that, well, if we talk about incentives, like that's not really sanctions, and then that's like presenting alternate that's not public forum. If we're talking about, well, we can have economic incentives or trade incentives or something, but then that's getting into a different a whole different line of reasoning, I guess, and I guess that's not public forum format.
Yeah, I definitely think those are important discussions to have. Like the terminology I put in the chat is really just like an iteration of what you and Stefan were saying, just like, and also what Emily is saying in the chat, where it's like, on the one hand, so let's say everyone wins that nothing happens, probably. That's where kind of the strength and the probability of your link, just arguing it better, kind of helps. And also this argumentation of like, is it better to at least try on the mere risk that something good happens? Or is it dangerous enough to risk that something bad will happen, that if you know it probably won't do anything good? So in this like staying up to study for the test example, like on the one hand, you might not gain that much knowledge from cramming, but is it better to at least try? On the other hand, you're losing out on sleep. So you might argue that like, if you know you won't gain that much from studying at night, but you're going to lose out on sleep, maybe that will matter. You don't know, but it might matter that you were just less on the, your brain was less agile for the exam. Might that be a good enough reason to not do anything? So this could go either way, right? So, pros arguing risk of solvency, vote on, like, study on the risk that you might get something that will help you on the test. Con is saying risk of a disadvantage, like, don't do anything because it might do something bad. Yes. Probability weighing will definitely help you do that.
Yeah, no, that's good discussion to bring back to them, because they were pretty animated about it. So.
And I'd also note, kind of going to that idea, like if it's a conversation between if like the judge both believes that it will be detrimental for you not getting sleep, but also helpful that you might study, like weighing is what tells the judge which one matters more. And so having that analysis there is what, if the judge believes both those ideas are true, why do you pick one over the other?
For sure.
I mean, to kind of just do a little more with the example quickly, right? Like, I mean, say it's 2 a.m. and you realize you're going to fail your math test because you don't really understand any of the material, right? Then you might as well like, okay, I'll study till 4 or 5 and hopefully I'll learn enough to get like a C-, right? If you think you can probably get a B without studying, then it probably doesn't make any sense to stay up all night and like, get a D on the test, right? So to extend the analogy, it's like, well, how bad is it in China, right? Like, I mean, it's not great. Could it get a lot worse? Yeah. Right? Could there be a lot more nationalism? Yeah, maybe it'll happen anyhow, right? But I like, I think it was Paul, or I can't remember if it was Paul or Emily mentioned weight, right? Like you got to weigh this, like weigh the risks, right? Like, well, gee, if it's so bad, like, should we, and that's going to be how the pro or the con team characterizes it, right? Like, hey, it's really, really bad. Okay. There's systemic, like, is it like genocide that's going on in there, right? Or is it just like re-education? It's probably a little bit like in between, right? So like, could it end up being a lot worse, right? What like chances should we take? These are good things to kind of think about how they're going to play out, right? Because you have two different approaches, like going after the same thing. Like, remember we talked about like Medicare for all, right? It's like, well, I mean, look, the economy's gotten a little better, right? But it's like, well, look, the economy's going to, get really bad now. Excuse me, not Medicare for all, Green New Deal, right? The economy's really like tumbling downward, right? Imagine this was even like last April and all the wheels were falling off, right? Like, what do we have to lose? Let's kind of pass the Green New Deal. It's the only chance we've got. People are making this argument now, right? Like, oh, should we take on all this new debt? Should we spend 1.9 trillion, or should we try to spend a little less and target it? And the advocates are like, hey, like, we can't risk missing on the downside, right? Like, you know, maybe we'll take on some more debt, right? Like, they are making this comparative arguments, you know, whatever you think of them, right? They're like, hey, you know, like, things could get bad. So let's just like spend the money. We can deal with it. We can deal with the debt, right? Let's like presume for it. That's weighing. It's a link weighing.
And also to speak to Emily's question, uniqueness, just as a reminder to everyone, you want to have that in your contention, because it just essentially is just setting up the context for why your argument is uniquely valuable. And so if you don't do this, you leave it, essentially leave yourself vulnerable to your opponent, like explaining why your argument is like not unique in the status, in the like picture of reality. And so going to this next contention we'll get into, but basically like you need to establish that our relationship with China is in a precarious position for the argument to matter. So essentially establishing that like there's an issue going on that we need to resolve, that this argument is going to essentially resolve or make this the situation at hand worse.
So in this situation of controlling uniqueness, I get what you're saying, right? You want to be the person out there defining what the problem is so that you can make it match your solution better, right? Mm-hmm. So in this case, what would the pros controlling of the uniqueness want to sound like?
If you want to talk about like the human rights contention, they would like spend a lot of time explaining like about all the different human rights violations that are occurring and why they're really bad. And
would the con then downplay that because they're trying to say status quo is better than inflaming the situation more? Or how would they control it to their advantage?
I don't think they necessarily have to say, no, I don't think they would downplay it. I think they would say like their uniqueness specifically speaks to how sanctions make the situation worse.
Oh.
Because you have the same impact, right? And so uniqueness plays really well with impact, because essentially uniqueness is explaining the situation. Impact is saying why the situation's so bad. And so they essentially have the same kind of background context that like human rights violations are bad, they're occurring. The difference is like the links that are in the chain of reasoning that's happening there, that's saying that actually when you do a sanction, it's going to lead to the nationalism, it's going to lead to all this bad stuff. Whereas pro is saying sanctions is going to tell them to like cut it out, basically.
Okay, so the uniqueness is the situation, the context. Human rights violations exist. Human rights violations are bad and unacceptable. But one side believes that sanctions work and one side believes that they don't. And so you're sort of just defining a different philosophy. That's uniqueness too?
Debating the effectiveness of sanctions is more about links than uniqueness.
Okay.
But yeah, that's gonna be the crux of the debate. And I think that's what we were trying to get at earlier, is that a large portion of the debate is gonna be about you explaining like why your chain of reasoning makes sense and being able to compare that to your opponents and being able to, and so that's why Paul talked about like strength of link, being able to have that, to explain why yours make more sense is what's gonna like win you the debate. Yeah. Sorry, continue, Paul.
No worries. Yeah, no. So to speak to the uniqueness point here, specifically, it's like, yeah. So if Pro were to be able to prove that relations with China are so awesome that nothing could possibly harm them, right? Like, they would have, just in that way of describing the way things are now, they would have made this whole contention useless, right? Because if relations are great, then what's a tiny little, chink in that armor? On the other hand, if they were to say that relations are so bad that there's no point there's nothing to be done for them, then what's the point in this argument? Because it's saying like, all right, if our relations with China are already like dead, then why worry about harming them at all? So the uniqueness here needs to be a description of the way things are that says like the link, which is going to be that sanctions hurt relations, actually like do something. Like they are going to support the significance of the action taken. So here we're saying, okay, Biden just came in. On the one hand, we've got like, he's calling the Trump era sanctions like frivolous and arbitrary and all that. So there's reason to think like, okay, there's reason for China to think, okay, he's going to be better. On the other hand, Republicans are still always calling for stronger sanctions, and there's still this call for sanctions, and we're debating this topic right now. So like, we can imagine that like there is still that uncertainty as to whether sanctions will happen. So relations with China could go either way, and that would matter. If we sanction, that will necessarily show, right, that like, okay, Biden's going to continue the trend of sanctioning China. So it would represent a commitment to a negative relationship with China. And then you're going to point out why those relations are important. There are a couple of different ways you could go with this. You could talk about how we want to not have them do worse things in the South China Sea and Taiwan. And so like, insofar as we want to keep our general persistent engagement kind of just containment strategy with them, we don't want to inflame them any more than we have to. You could talk about the fact that on many fronts we need to cooperate with them. Disease research, you talk about COVID. You could talk about the fact that like international cooperation when it comes to pandemics is good, and the more bridges we sort of burn by harming international relations, the less the probability that we'll get the level of cooperation to effectively like handle pandemics. And you'll find lots of research on there about why like the next pandemic is going to kill tons of people and all of that. So it'll be easy to continue to impact. Climate change, two biggest emitters ever. If someone is going to set the stage as far as like meeting IPCC recommendations, then it needs to be us. And so you point out that like we need to be working together on climate change. Again, your kids just spent a whole month researching why cooperation on climate change or action on climate change is important. And then we've got like space exploration stuff. Sorry, didn't mean to do that. You could talk about how, as we mentioned last time, like China has some serious space technology. We don't want them shooting down our satellites because that would really cripple us. So to some extent, we want to represent friendship, not enemies. Yet another direction you could go that kind of is a spin-off of the relationship, but has its own significance, right, is the trade war example. So you're pointing out that, we just went through this, right? Like we impose tariffs on China, China can impose tariffs back on us, and that hurts us. So this is kind of one that history has empirically proven, and you could go on and argue and talk about how that hurts the economy, causes people to lose jobs, etc. An interesting way to go into like how you link into these sanctions actually happening, this backlash actually happening, is to go the nationalist route as well. So the nationalism contention and this one kind of have that interplay. I know I just went through two without asking for questions. Apologies. Are there questions on either of them?
So the only thing the uniqueness here though is this is going to be interesting because so far Biden is following Trump's path with direct, how they're talking about China. So, how does that play into how we present? You know what I mean? Like, if I can refute it by saying, well, actually, there's nothing much has changed now that Biden's president, for instance. you know, is there, I guess, a way to combat the uniqueness, or what is the most effective way to combat?
I think what you want to try to say, like when you're con, is that like sanctions on human rights are kind of especially problematic to relations, right? Like relations are being juggled, right? You know, Biden's like a little bit more moderate than Trump, or at least he's less nasty. So, you know, that's kind of appreciated, right? I'd probably try to make an argument on the con that like, sure, China realizes that like there's economic competition between countries. There's military competition between countries, but they don't like other people like sticking their nose in their business. Like they think this is their business, like how they want to deal with kind of what they see as like this outsider threat, right? I mean, imagine if China sanctioned the US because we were building a wall, right? Okay, right? Like, okay, or we limited a refugee, like we imposed a refugee, like we lowered the refugee cap, right? Or like, you know, even like how we kind of manage, you know, prisons and jails. We'd say that's none of your business. Like how we manage ourselves internally, and that especially like makes them angry. Any countries compete economically and militarily, right? Of course that causes tension, right? But it's like when you take a jab at like how they operate, right? I mean, just think about it. If China said, well, hey, we're going to impose these trade sanctions till you like stop building the wall, like Trump would like laugh in their face, right? And I bet even some like Americans who don't support the wall would probably be like angry with that, right? Being like, well, who are you to like tell us whether or not like, you know, we should let in refugees or like build a wall. So I really try to emphasize that as being like a really something that's especially inflaming of tensions, right? Like China will say like, oh, you don't think we should imprison the Uyghurs? You fly drones around in the Middle East and kill Muslims, right? So, but anyhow, that's what I would try to emphasize, right? That has a unique, really uniquely kind of poisons the relations.
Yeah, it's a question of sovereignty.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And so what we, you know, what we can kind of think here is that like this goes back to the risk of the disadvantage thing, because con kind of has this link in the bag, like in the sense that it makes just analytical almost sense that sanctions will at least not have some negative effect on relations. They will have some negative effect on relations with another country. You're telling that country, we're doing something wrong, you're doing something wrong, we're going to punish you. They're not going to be happy about it, right? The question of like, can you win on this contention is going to come down to, therefore, the kind of impact weighing, and also the significance of like how much you can prove that it hurting relations will lead to the impacts. So that's kind of how this one needs to be thought about if your kids are going to use it.
And I think also just pointing to like the fact that like, and you don't need to establish that like sanctions are necessarily going to be like the bright line between like a good or bad relationship, but that like sanctions have the potential to like be a tipping point. And so as long as like you can establish that it's not one way or the other, that our relationship is so great or that it's so bad that it like wouldn't make a difference, as long as there's that like potential for it to make a difference, your uniqueness should be fine. But I would, if you're going to use this contention, like prepare your debaters for that conversation to occur.
All right, questions about the trade war? Thoughts maybe about it?
So you want to talk about how it connects to the national backlash? Like that it would create a nationalist backlash here towards China? Because our economy would be affected?
So the the nationalism point here is that there will be a greater, so China wants to expand and be more globally competitive, if not dominant. The perception that we are standing very squarely in the way of that by sanctioning, by trying to limit trade with them and by trying to make trade with them harder, would result in a quickness to try to at least do the same, if not just generally hurt us economically with similar measures.
So the risk is of Chinese nationalist backlash.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And there is an article linked here that talks about it a little bit more. All right, Emily is going to talk to you about how Pro might talk about these things if you just heard them in the con constructive.
Okay. So first, we're gonna have a conversation about solvency. And so we kind of started this presentation by discussing all the ways con can say that sanctions won't work, or at best like ineffective. And so before we really get into this, basically kind of a conversation, at least on the first point, is does Pro need to solve for human rights? Does anyone want to take a guess at that? In order to win, does Pro need to solve for human rights?
I want to say no, but it's kind of like I'm in the middle with it. I'm not, confident of that. I want to say that I think especially if you're doing like a trade war argument, you're dealing with competition, you're not dealing with sovereignty. And I think you can win on that side. I don't know if you can win overall. I don't know if that second argument right now, I don't have it in my mind, that might put you over, but I definitely think you can make a good run of it without it, and I think possibly win. I'm not sure.
Is the argument here that you have a moral obligation to try? I don't have to say it's going to solve it, but I have to say that we have to try.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that question is just pointing to the idea that Pro can still have offense without actually like changing anything. And so, yeah, so it like clearly it's like depends on the debate, and it's literally the debate if that could win you the debate. But Pro can still gain offense without actually proving that they solve the issue. And the issue like here could be human rights. And so, and yeah, so when we discuss solvency, that literally means do we solve the problem that like we discuss in our impact. And so Pro is going to stand up there and discuss how like this is a huge human rights violation. Sanctions are the way to like solve this problem. And even if con can defeat the idea that sanctions will like not solve this issue, you can still have a conversation about why it's important that we do it anyway. And so the first way you can kind of discuss that is we have a moral obligation. And so you can look that we sanctioned South Africa for apartheid. Like even though it didn't end it in any means, it's still important for us to make a stand as like a world leader to demonstrate that like cultural cleansing and genocide is wrong. And so, yeah, so it really depends how that will stack up with other arguments that are presented in the round. But that is still a piece of offense that Pro should engage in. Additionally, international norm setting. So you could also bring into the fold the idea that not only is it our moral obligation, that it then sets a standard for the international community that we essentially don't condone human rights violations. And that's really important for like the future. And like, I don't know if you go as far as a deterrent argument, but being able to set an international norm that human rights violations are not tolerated is really important. And honestly, like a front line to that could be the hypocrisy argument, but we can get into that later. And then lastly, the US doing it could also lead to other countries doing it. And if you want to talk about the conversation about sanctions actually solving issues, if the US does it and like so does like 10 other countries, then maybe that is enough pressure to change China's opinion and their practices. And so there's definitely ways you can combat the fact that sanctions don't solve necessarily. And so that should be like a really crucial form of clash that should be happening in the debate. And if you have a practice debate and the debaters aren't discussing whether or not sanctions are good or bad or like are effective or not, definitely like talk to them about that, because that's going to be one of the biggest parts of the debate, is essentially having this discussion about the efficacy of them actually leading to the results you're talking about, and even if they don't, how they can still matter as a statement anyway. Any questions on that?
No, but on support for the international pressure, that comes to like a leadership thing. So you can double down, I think, on that argument, add that extra line underneath it, right? Where in fact, if you go out there and you gather the support of all these other people, something happens positive, then next time, you know what I mean, you're building that cachet as well. So kind of like same thing for the norm setting, but I think a little bit more effective when things actually happen versus just being said.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah, definitely can have a conversation, and like you could definitely push that like this has effects like going forward when countries are like considering doing bad things, that like they'll recognize that it's like a big no, and so they won't. And like, you know, you can like, it requires a lot of like a bit of links and like thinking through like the idea itself, but it is a good response when they're discussing like the validity of a sanction working. Any other questions? Okay. And so this is specifically looking at the international relations contention and how relations are, Khan is going to argue that relations are harmed with sanctions. And so basically this is kind of just going through, if you remember, our rebuttal techniques. So first starting with no link, so basically picking out the link chain that they're discussing that actually a sanction won't make them really angry. And so it won't result in all these like harms to relations. What we were talking about earlier that we're trying to preempt with our uniqueness idea is that either other things we're doing are going to anger China, so it doesn't matter that we're doing sanctions, and it'll still harm these relationships, or yeah. And so just speaking to the idea that regardless of if we do a sanction or not, it's still going to harm our relationship with China, is still going to be net negative because of what we do militarily, for example. And so that kind of takes out the argument there. In addition, you can talk about the impacts themselves and say that, even if we do cooperate on diseases, it's not going to be fruitful. I mean, I guess you could say climate change is not the biggest issue. You know, we did this last topic. That's probably not the most convincing argument, but you could say it. And then basically the US can deter China from attacking Taiwan in the South China Sea. And so basically that sanctions are not going to like push it one way or the other. And so these are just some ideas to think through. Just wanted to provide you with those just to think about how you can go about sort of the interactions that should be happening in the round on both sides. Yeah, so that was a lot. So if any questions, feel free to let me know. Sorry, just reading the comments. yeah, so that's it on con. I think we're a little over time, but we can have a further discussion if anyone has any questions on anything we talked about.
Or anything else.
Yeah.
I missed part of the pro the other, and again today also. So I don't know if spying in general was included on either side of the argument, like industrial and also just a little good old kind of cloak and dagger, government style spying. Were those included in the pros or in the cons? Did I just miss something and have to go back and read?
We discussed it a bit on pro. I don't know if we can go back, Paul. Yeah.
Yeah, China stealing.
If it's there, I'll be able to see it later. I don't need to hold it there for me. But the actual kind of like yeah, no, that's good. Thank you.
Is the con answer to that contention that it's that again sanctions are ineffective and may even be adverse, like making them double down with a nationalist reaction to do more spying?
We do it too.
Also, we do it too.
I mean, the we do it too. You'd have to think about whether the we do it too is responsive, because, the fact that we do it too doesn't mean we don't want to stop them from doing it, right? Like, and that for us at least, stopping them from doing it can be good.
Assuming that would be the weight argument against me, the Wade argument against me.
Okay. Yeah, but yeah, this one is very much like the con answer is pretty much going to be one of like China's rise is inevitable, and like, a combination of sanctions aren't going to do enough, and like China's eventually going to double down on it anyway, kind of thing. So you agree that kind of like the uniqueness here is too strong for the link of like sanctions to actually solve it. Like, China's on the rise and there's no way that you can stop it. Therefore, the link doesn't actually solve.